On a seemingly ordinary flight, everything took an unexpected turn when Heather, an arrogant flight attendant, deliberately insulted and mistreated a black passenger. What she didn't know was that the woman she looked down on was actually an FBI agent. This intense confrontation not only exposed injustice, but also delivered a profound lesson on kindness and transformation. What happened when the truth came to light? Can small actions truly change a person? Watch to uncover this powerful and emotional story. The plane, filled with passengers, was preparing to take off from Atlanta to Chicago, a journey of over 2 hours. The usual bustling atmosphere was present: rolling suitcases on the floor, the laughter of children, and the steady voice of the flight crew giving safety instructions. In a quiet corner of the economy class, Rachel Hayes sat silently, her sharp eyes occasionally gazing out the window. She wore a simple gray sweater, black jeans, and a pair of worn out sneakers. Her outfit made her blend in as just another ordinary passenger, but no one would have guessed that she was actually an FBI agent on her way to carry out an important mission. Rachel had deliberately chosen a seat in economy class, not out of frugality or a love for cramped spaces, but because she knew that discretion was always an agent's best ally. Rachel smiled softly as she thought about her family back in New York. She missed the simple holidays spent with her mother and younger sister, but duty never waited. Just a few more days, she reminded herself, gripping the small briefcase that contained highly classified files. At the front of the cabin, Heather Shaw strode down the aisle with an air of arrogance. Her flight attendant uniform had become her symbol of authority, and her gaze swept over the passengers as if she were inspecting them one by one. Heather took great pride in her position, not only because of her job, but also because of the powerful connections within her family. Her uncle, Sheriff Shaw, was a prominent figure in the region, and she knew his reputation served as a shield, protecting her from any trouble. Heather couldn't hide her annoyance when she noticed Rachel, a black passenger, sitting near the window. "Another one of them," she muttered under her breath. Heather had a habit of making snap judgments, especially about people she deemed unworthy of sharing the same flight as her. Rumors about Heather had been circulating within the airline for some time. She was arrogant and often displayed discriminatory attitudes toward passengers, yet no one dared to report her, given the strong backing she had from her influential family. As the cabin settled and the plane prepared for takeoff, the atmosphere became calmer. Rachel closed her eyes, trying to relax before the long journey ahead. She had no idea that she was about to become the center of a confrontation she never anticipated. The journey seemed peaceful at first glance, but beneath the calm surface, a storm was silently brewing. The plane had leveled off at 10,000 meters. The cabin lights dimmed softly, and passengers began to immerse themselves in their own activities. Some were engrossed in books, others put on headphones to listen to music or quietly chatted with those beside them. Rachel observed silently. As an agent, she was used to reading the body language of those around her. Each passenger on this flight had their own story, and she often wondered about the journeys that had brought them here. But today, Rachel focused on her mission. She mentally reviewed the critical details for the last time, her gaze occasionally drifting out the window at the endless expanse of white clouds. Heather Shaw moved through the economy cabin with her usual attitude, cold and authoritative. Holding a tray of water, she passed through the rows of seats without so much as glancing at the passengers. When she approached Rachel, she paused, tilted her head for a quick look, and then continued walking without a word. "Excuse me," Rachel spoke gently. "Could I have a glass of water, please?" Heather stopped, turned around with a disdainful look. "We'll serve water later," she replied curtly, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Right now, I have more important things to do." Rachel raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything further. A few passengers nearby turned to look, their expressions a mix of confusion and discomfort. An elderly woman seated across from Rachel clicked her tongue softly, but quickly looked away when Heather shot her a glance. Heather continued down the aisle, but inside, an inexplicable frustration bubbled up. Who does she think she is? Heather thought to herself. Passengers like Rachel always gave her a reason to assert her authority. A little later, when meals were being served, Heather continued to display blatant favoritism. Other passengers received their full meals along with her cold yet professional smile. When it came to Rachel's turn, Heather deliberately skipped her, pretending not to notice. "Excuse me," Rachel spoke up, this time with a patient but firmer tone. "It seems you missed my meal." Heather stopped, turning toward Rachel with a challenging glare. "Oh, really? I don't think it's my job to cater to your every whim," she replied. Her voice dripped with sarcasm, and the air around them grew tense. Rachel stared straight at Heather, her eyes sharp as blades. But instead of escalating the situation, she responded calmly, "I just expect you to do your job." A moment of stifling silence hung in the air. Heather scoffed, slamming the meal tray onto Rachel's table with deliberate force before walking away. A few other passengers turned to look at Rachel, but no one said a word. A young man sitting 2 rows away shrugged, his expression seemingly saying, "There's nothing we can do." Rachel sighed and opened her meal. It wasn't hunger that compelled her, but a desire to move past the situation. She knew that sometimes silence was the best way to deal with people like Heather. Yet, deep inside, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the blatant injustice around her. Before long, the tension continued to escalate. Rachel stood up to retrieve an item from the overhead luggage compartment. The plane swayed slightly, and she moved cautiously as she opened the compartment. However, Heather, noticing Rachel standing, immediately approached her with a look of annoyance. "Sit down immediately," Heather barked, her tone more of a command than a request. "Don't you see the seatbelt sign is on?" Rachel, maintaining her composure, calmly replied, "I just need to grab something. It'll only take a few seconds." Heather didn't give Rachel a chance to act further. She forcefully slammed the luggage compartment shut and turned to Rachel with a glare of hostility. "Who do you think you are, blatantly ignoring the rules on this flight?" Heather practically shouted, loud enough for everyone in the cabin to hear. Rachel clenched her fists, her eyes flashing with a restrained anger, but she managed to remain incredibly composed. "I don't think retrieving a personal item is that big of an issue," she said in a steady, assured voice. Heather, sensing an underlying challenge in Rachel's response, grew even more agitated. "I'm tired of people like you," she said, her words now tinged with clear prejudice. "Always causing trouble, always making demands. You have no right to talk back here, and if you don't sit down immediately, I'll call security." Rachel stared directly at Heather, saying nothing. Her silence carried the weight of a declaration, making Heather feel even more provoked. A few passengers nearby began whispering among themselves. A middle-aged woman, seemingly unable to bear it any longer, muttered, "This is ridiculous." But when Heather turned and shot her a sharp look, she quickly fell silent. A young man sitting nearby, Tommy, seemed on the verge of standing up to say something, but his girlfriend tugged at his arm. "Don't get involved," she whispered. "We don't know what she's capable of." For a brief moment, Heather felt triumphant. She turned back to Rachel and, raising her voice for everyone to hear, said, "I don't care who you think you are. On this flight, I'm in charge, and if you don't want to cause trouble, sit down and stay silent." Rachel slowly returned to her seat, her gaze never leaving Heather. Beneath her calm exterior, however, Rachel was already forming a plan to address this injustice, not with empty words, but with the truth. Heather continued to pace up and down the aisle, her sharp eyes sweeping over Rachel, as if waiting for the smallest mistake to use as an excuse. Meanwhile, Rachel, after everything that had happened, chose to quietly observe, mentally noting each of Heather's actions and words. Not long after, another situation arose. An elderly passenger seated near Rachel pressed the call button. She was struggling with her seatbelt, unable to unfasten it to go to the restroom. Heather approached, but her indifferent demeanor made no effort to hide her lack of willingness to help. "What do you need?" Heather asked, her tone devoid of politeness. The elderly woman, appearing slightly embarrassed, explained her situation. Heather sighed loudly, unfastening the seatbelt with an abrupt and impatient gesture. Then, without saying another word, she turned and walked away. Rachel witnessed the entire incident. Part of her wanted to stand up and say something, but she knew that doing so would only escalate the conflict. Still, her eyes betrayed her disapproval. Heather caught Rachel's gaze. "Do you have a problem?" she asked loudly, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. Rachel lifted her head, her voice calm. No, I don't, but it seems you do. The air seemed to freeze for a few seconds. Heather smirked, her voice dripping with mockery. Oh, really? Let me guess. You think I'm not serving you well enough, don't you? Maybe you're used to being pampered, but let me make this clear. On this flight, I'm the one in charge. If you don't like it, you're welcome to leave. Rachel maintained her composed gaze, unfazed by Heather's provocation. But the murmurs among the passengers began to grow louder. Some glanced at Rachel with sympathy, while others threw irritated looks at Heather but remained silent. Not long after, Heather found another opportunity to create trouble. When Rachel stood up to go to the restroom, Heather quickly stepped in and blocked her path. The seatbelt sign is still on, Heather said firmly. You're not allowed to move. Rachel glanced at the seatbelt sign. It was clearly off, but she didn't want to escalate the situation further. I just need to use the restroom, she replied, her tone gentle yet firm. No, Heather interrupted. Sit down immediately. The sign is off, Rachel responded, her tone still calm but with a slight edge. And I don't think my going to the restroom is a problem. This time, Rachel's voice carried a firmness that made it clear she wasn't easily intimidated. Heather, sensing the challenge, grew angrier. If you don't follow my instructions immediately, I'll be forced to report you to the lead crew member. Let's see where that gets you. Rachel didn't reply. She simply stood still, her gaze steady on Heather, not angry, not fearful, but calm, with an unshakable determination simmering beneath the surface. Eventually, Heather exhaled sharply, feigning exasperation, but said nothing more. She turned and walked away, though not without shooting Rachel one last icy glare, as if to say the matter was far from over. When Rachel returned to her seat, she discovered that her meal had been cleared away, even though she hadn't finished eating. She looked at the empty table in front of her and let out a faint, dry chuckle. She wasn't hungry, but Heather's actions made it clear that the situation had escalated far beyond what was necessary. A young passenger sitting 2 rows away, Tommy, couldn't hold back any longer. He leaned over and spoke to Rachel in a low but determined voice. I'm so sorry for what she's done. It's completely wrong. Rachel gave him a gentle smile. Thank you. But it's all right. I'm used to things like this. Tommy looked at Rachel with admiration. I don't know how you're staying so calm. If it were me, I don't think I could take it. Rachel simply smiled again, but deep down she knew she couldn't let this continue. She didn't want to create a scene on the flight, but at the same time, she couldn't allow this blatant injustice to go unchecked. The flight continued under a cloud of tension. Heather maintained her arrogant demeanor, not just toward Rachel, but also toward other passengers. She frequently brought up her uncle, Sheriff Shaw, as a way to intimidate anyone who dared to challenge her. Rachel noticed the fear in the eyes of many passengers. A middle-aged woman whispered to the person beside her, does she think she's some kind of queen? Just because she has someone powerful backing her, she acts like this. Heather, seemingly aware of the murmurs, only became more defiant. She walked past Rachel, stopped, and spoke with exaggerated sarcasm. I hope this flight isn't too uncomfortable for you, but if you're not happy, I'm sure my uncle would be more than happy to explain everything to you when we land. For the first time, Rachel's gaze showed a hint of defiance. I look forward to it, she replied, her voice calm but firm enough to make Heather pause for a moment. Up ahead, the journey was nearing its end, but Heather had no idea that when the plane touched down, things would no longer play out the way she imagined. The announcement from the cockpit echoed through the cabin, notifying passengers that the flight was preparing to land. The cabin lights dimmed, and passengers began adjusting their seats and fastening their seatbelts. However, the atmosphere between Rachel and Heather remained as tense as a tightly drawn string. Heather continued to project an air of arrogance, yet internally she felt more agitated than ever. Rachel's silence and refusal to react to her provocations made Heather feel increasingly challenged. Heather stepped toward Rachel's area, this time with a bolder decision in mind. You've been sitting here long enough, but I don't think you really belong on this flight, Heather said, deliberately loud enough for the nearby passengers to hear. Rachel slowly raised her head, her expression calm. What exactly are you implying? Don't pretend you don't understand. Heather continued, her tone laced with mockery. I've seen enough of people like you. You cause trouble, make demands, and never know your place. A wave of murmurs spread across the cabin. Several passengers turned to look, their expressions a mix of shock and discomfort at Heather's words. This time, Tommy, the young man who had been observing the situation, could no longer stay silent. He stood up and stared directly at Heather. She hasn't done anything wrong, Tommy said loudly. You're deliberately abusing your power to bully someone else. We've all seen it. Heather whirled around, her eyes blazing with anger. Who do you think you are to speak up here? This isn't your business. Actually, it's everyone's business, Tommy replied firmly. You've gone too far. We didn't pay for these tickets to sit here and witness such unprofessional behavior. Heather's face turned pale, but under the scrutinizing gazes of the passengers, she was forced to maintain her composure. I'll be reporting you for causing a disturbance, she said coldly, and I'll let security handle you when we land. Rachel, who had remained silent up until now, decided to speak. I think what you should be reporting is not the passengers, but your own behavior. Heather turned back to face Rachel, but this time there was a flicker of unease in her eyes. Are you threatening me? She asked, her voice sharp. Rachel shrugged, her tone still calm. No, I'm just stating the truth, and I'm certain that when we land, the truth will speak for itself. The plane began its descent, preparing to land. Heather, outwardly confident, felt a growing sense of unease. She had mentioned her uncle, Sheriff Shaw, multiple times, hoping it would silence Rachel and intimidate the other passengers. But this time, she realized she had pushed things too far. When the plane touched down, Heather immediately left her position. Using the internal communication system, she called airport security. There's a suspicious passenger, she said quickly into the microphone. I need you to wait at the gate when passengers disembark. We can't allow any risks. She emphasized her words with an authoritative tone, hoping to quickly quash any potential issues. But what Heather didn't know was that this decision would become the turning point of everything. As the plane came to a full stop, passengers began to rise from their seats and disembark. A few glanced back at Rachel with sympathetic eyes, but no one spoke. Rachel stood up, retrieving her small carry-on from the overhead compartment. Her gaze briefly passed over Heather, showing no anger or fear. Instead, it held a calmness that made Heather feel even more uneasy. At the entrance of the plane, two airport security officers stood waiting. Heather quickly approached them, pointing toward Rachel. That's the one I told you about, she said loudly. She caused trouble throughout the flight, and I suspect she has bad intentions. Rachel walked up calmly, her composed eyes meeting those of the security officers. How can I help you, gentlemen? She asked softly. One of the officers, seemingly the one in charge, looked slightly uneasy. We just need to check your belongings, ma'am, he said, though his tone lacked confidence. Rachel chuckled lightly, then slowly reached into her jacket pocket. She pulled out a shiny badge, the letters FBI clearly engraved on its surface. Well, what a coincidence, she said, her voice calm yet brimming with authority. I happen to have a few questions for airport security and perhaps for Miss Heather Shaw as well. Both security officers froze in disbelief, their eyes fixed on the badge. Heather, standing beside them, seemed paralyzed. Her face turned pale, and for the first time during the entire flight, she was speechless. Rachel continued, her tone unwavering. I'm a federal agent, and I'm on my way to complete an important mission. The harassment, insults, and deliberate obstacles I faced during this flight are not only inappropriate, but also an obstruction of justice. Heather took a step back, her eyes darting around as if searching for someone to save her. I I didn't know, she stammered. I was just doing my job. Rachel raised an eyebrow. Really? You repeatedly abused your authority and insulted passengers based on personal prejudice, and I'm certain that if this is reported, you'll face far more serious consequences than just a reprimand. A tense silence filled the air. Passengers who had been slowly disembarking began stopping to witness the scene. A few started clapping, a subtle yet unmistakable show of support for Rachel and their disapproval of Heather. Heather opened her mouth as if to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She couldn't believe that the passenger she had looked down on throughout the flight was actually an FBI agent, someone with far more authority and credibility than she could ever have imagined. With one final glance at Heather, Rachel turned to the security officers. I think we need to have a serious discussion, she said, and perhaps Miss Heather should join us. Heather lowered her head, trying to hide her embarrassment. Meanwhile, Rachel, as composed as ever, exuded a quiet but undeniable sense of justice. The airport security room was brightly lit under the glare of white lights. The cold, sterile walls reflected the seriousness of the space. Rachel entered, her posture calm, yet her eyes resolute. Heather followed behind, her gaze shifting between regret and a desperate attempt to cling to her last shred of dignity. Waiting in the room were the head of airport security and a few other personnel, including Heather's uncle, Sheriff Shaw. Uncle, Heather exclaimed, her voice a mix of surprise and relief. I didn't expect you to be here. This is just a small misunderstanding. Sheriff Shaw, a middle-aged man with streaks of silver in his hair and piercing eyes, turned to look at his niece. He didn't reply immediately, his gaze quickly shifting to Rachel, who stood upright and unwavering across the room. Years of experience in law enforcement told him instantly that Rachel was no ordinary woman. Who are you? Shaw asked, Shadea, his voice firm and commanding. Rachel didn't respond immediately. Instead, she reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out her FBI badge, holding it up for everyone in the room to see. The light reflecting off the badge caught Heather's eyes, making her instinctively step back. I am Special Agent Rachel Hayes, she said, her voice steady and authoritative. I'm on my way to complete an important federal mission during which I was harassed, insulted, and deliberately hindered by flight attendant Heather Shaw. Shaw froze, his expression betraying his shock. He turned to look at Heather, who had gone completely pale. What is the meaning of this, Heather? He asked, his voice low and full of warning. Heather stammered, I I didn't know she was an agent. I thought she what? Rachel interjected sharply, her tone cutting. You thought I didn't deserve to be treated with respect because I'm a black passenger? Or did you think your uncle's influence would protect you from the consequences of your actions? Heather didn't respond. Her eyes darted nervously around the room, searching for an escape from the situation. Sheriff Shaw took a deep breath, trying to maintain his composure. He turned to Rachel and said, Agent Hayes, I sincerely apologize for this incident. My niece has clearly acted unprofessionally and caused you significant offense. Rachel raised an eyebrow, her piercing gaze never leaving Heather. Unprofessionalism is one thing, but systemic discrimination and abuse of power are entirely different matters. Shaw nodded slightly, understanding he couldn't evade accountability. He turned to Heather, his tone growing firmer. Heather, do you realize the consequences of abusing your authority and exhibiting discriminatory behavior? Do you understand how this will impact your career and the reputation of our family? I just... Heather began to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Rachel broke the silence, her voice cutting through the tension. Apologies won't suffice without tangible actions. I don't want this matter to end here without a lesson being learned. At that moment, another security officer entered the room carrying a folder. He handed it to the head of airport security and whispered something in his ear. Rachel suspected it was a report from other passengers on the flight, those who had witnessed the entire ordeal. Agent Hayes, the security head spoke up, we've collected statements from several passengers. According to them, flight attendant Shaw displayed disrespectful behavior not only toward you but also toward multiple other passengers. This is unacceptable. Rachel nodded, her gaze fixed on Shaw. I trust this situation will be handled appropriately. Not because I'm an FBI agent, but because every passenger deserves to be treated with fairness and respect. Shaw, now fully aware of the gravity of the situation, let out a heavy sigh. He turned to Heather, his voice no longer angry, but deeply disappointed. Heather, what have you done? This isn't just unprofessional behavior. You've tarnished the reputation of our family, the airline industry, and most importantly, you've harmed someone who didn't deserve such treatment. Heather lowered her head, her shoulders trembling. She knew there was no escaping responsibility this time, but her regret couldn't undo what had already happened. Rachel observed the scene before her, a mixture of anger and sorrow stirring within. Throughout her career, she had faced countless injustices, But each time she held on to hope that the truth would come to light and those responsible would be held accountable. Justice isn't just about punishment, Rachel said, her voice gentle yet commanding. It's about teaching each of us to respect one another, regardless of race, class, or status. The room fell into silence. Rachel's words resonated like a bell, reminding everyone present that justice and respect are the foundation of a fair society. Sheriff Shaw stood still, his tired, aging eyes reflecting disappointment and wariness. He wasn't just witnessing a shameful incident involving his niece, he was confronting an unjust system he had unknowingly enabled. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, then slowly stepped toward Heather. Heather, his voice was deep and cold, you've crossed the line. This time, I can't protect you. Heather's eyes widened, disbelief etched across her face. But uncle, I didn't know she was an agent. I just thought, enough. Shaw cut her off, his voice echoing with authority, silencing the entire room. What you thought doesn't matter. The issue here is that you abused your power, exhibited discriminatory behavior, and hurt others. Not just Agent Hayes, but also the other passengers on that flight. Heather lowered her head, her usual confidence and arrogance utterly dissolved. In their place was a profound sense of shame and confusion. She opened her mouth, attempting to speak, but no justification came to her. Rachel watched the entire scene unfold with a calm expression, though her eyes held a firm resolve. She knew that for change to occur, people like Heather needed to face not just consequences, but also education and a deep understanding of their actions. Sheriff Shaw, Rachel spoke, breaking the silence in the room. I'm not here to demand severe punishment for Heather. I'm here to ensure that she and anyone else will never behave like this toward anyone again. Shaw turned to Rachel and nodded. I understand, Agent Hayes. I will ensure that Heather faces the consequences of her actions. He turned to the airport security chief, his tone commanding. Gather statements from every passenger on that flight. I want everything documented clearly. The airline and the flight crew must also be held accountable for supervising their staff. The security chief nodded. We'll take care of it immediately, sir. Outside the security room, a group of passengers had gathered. News of Rachel being an FBI agent had spread quickly, and many began expressing their support for her. A middle-aged woman who had witnessed the entire incident on the plane stepped forward and asked to meet Rachel. Rachel walked out of the room, noticing the group of passengers waiting. The middle-aged woman approached her, taking Rachel's hands. You're so brave, the woman said, her voice trembling. We're deeply sorry for staying silent during the flight, but you stood up, not just for yourself, but for all of us. Rachel smiled softly. Thank you. But the important thing isn't about me. It's about us standing together against wrongdoing. Silence only allows injustice to continue. Tommy, the young man who had tried to defend Rachel on the plane, stepped forward, his voice filled with emotion. I almost didn't do anything because I thought I couldn't make a difference, but you've shown me that just one voice can change everything. Rachel nodded, her expression softening. Thank you for standing up, Tommy. Change begins with the smallest actions. Inside the security room, Heather sat in silence, her head bowed low. Her entire body felt heavy, as though she had no strength left to stand. She had never imagined that her arrogance would one day lead to such serious consequences. Sheriff Shaw approached Heather, placing a hand on her shoulder. Heather, I hope you'll learn from this lesson. Not everyone gets a second chance, but I won't abandon you. We'll do everything we can to make this right. Heather looked up, tears streaming down her face. I'm sorry, Uncle. I didn't realize how much I was hurting others. Don't just apologize, Shaw said, his voice gentle but firm. Change. As things wound down, Rachel prepared to leave the airport. Before departing, she turned to Heather one last time. Heather, I hope that from today you'll stop judging people by their race or background. We're all human, and we all deserve to be treated with fairness. Heather couldn't respond. She simply nodded, her mind swirling with conflicting emotions. Rachel walked away, her posture proud and confident. She didn't need to say anything more. Truth had already spoken for itself. The remaining passengers, the security personnel, and even Heather would carry the lesson of this day with them forever. Rachel stepped through the airport's large glass doors, the icy Chicago air filling her lungs. Her demeanor remained calm and composed, yet inside she felt a profound sense of relief. This flight had been more than a journey to her mission. It had been a small battle, another challenge she had overcome, not with weapons or authority, but with patience and faith in justice. Behind her, Sheriff Shaw stood in the security room, watching Rachel's silhouette disappear through the glass. He let out a heavy sigh, realizing the magnitude of what had just transpired, not only for Heather, but for himself as well. Deep down, he vowed to never allow anyone in his family or organization to repeat the behaviors Heather had exhibited. Heather sat in the security room for a long while after Rachel left. Everything felt like a nightmare, yet it was also a profound wake-up call. She had never imagined that her attitude and behavior could lead to such serious consequences. For years, she had lived in arrogance, believing her family's influence was a shield that protected her from accountability. But today, she realized that shield could not conceal the wrongs rooted in her own actions. Sheriff Shaw approached Heather, his gaze a mix of sternness and compassion. Heather, I let you go too far. This is my fault. I enabled you and failed to teach you the right way. But from now on, things will be different. Heather lowered her head, her voice trembling. I'm truly sorry, Uncle. I didn't realize how wrong I was. Sorry isn't enough, Shaw replied, his voice deep and resolute. You need to act. From today onward, you will take responsibility for what you've done. I'll request the airline to suspend you so you'll have time to reflect and improve yourself. This isn't a punishment. It's a chance for you to learn how to be a better person. Heather nodded, tears streaming down her face. For the first time, she felt the weight of responsibility and the seriousness of the need to change. The next day, the airline issued a public apology to Rachel and all passengers on the flight. In their statement, they promised to improve staff training procedures, ensuring that every passenger, regardless of race, class, or background, would be treated with fairness and respect. Rachel received the apology via a personal email, but she didn't dwell on it. For her, the work was far from over, and justice remained her ultimate pursuit, not for fame or personal gain, but for her belief in building a better, more just society. Following her suspension, Heather began attending courses on cultural awareness and professional behavior. Each day, she reminded herself of the valuable lessons she had learned. Heather also wrote a heartfelt letter to Rachel, expressing her sincere remorse and gratitude for the chance Rachel had given her to change. In the letter, she wrote, Dear Agent Hayes, I am writing this not to seek forgiveness, but to thank you for teaching me a lesson I will never forget. I was wrong, and I know I cannot undo the harm I caused, but I promise to do everything I can to become a better person, not just in my work, but in my life. Thank you for choosing not to retaliate, but instead for helping me realize my mistakes. Rachel received the letter on a cold winter's day while working on an assignment in a small town. She read it silently, then smiled softly. She didn't reply, but inside she felt a sense of peace. Justice, she believed, wasn't just about exposing the wrongdoer, but also about giving them the opportunity to make things right. When other passengers on the flight learned about the outcome, many felt inspired. Tommy, the young man who had stood up for Rachel, shared a post about the incident on social media. The post quickly went viral, garnering thousands of likes and shares. In it, Tommy wrote, That day, I witnessed the strongest woman I've ever met. She stood up not just for herself, but for all of us, those who had stayed silent in the face of injustice. She taught me that justice doesn't come from power, but from courage and mutual respect. Thank you, Agent Hayes, for showing me what it truly means to be a hero. A week after the incident, Rachel returned to Chicago to complete her mission. As she walked through the airport, a few staff members recognized her and greeted her with respectful nods. Rachel didn't pause, but in her heart, she knew this story had left a lasting impact, not just on Heather, but on everyone who had witnessed it. She stepped out of the airport, feeling the faint winter sunlight gently touch her face. In that moment, Rachel felt complete. She didn't seek fame or recognition for what she had done. Her actions weren't about proving herself right, they were about doing what was right. The story came to an end, but the lessons it carried would resonate forever. Justice isn't only found in grand gestures, but also in small acts. acts that can change how people treat one another and how we see ourselves. Life often presents us with challenges, forcing us to choose how we respond. Rachel Hayes' story reminds us that courage, patience, and faith in justice can overcome even the greatest injustices. Rather than seeking revenge, she chose to stand up, not just for herself, but to spread a powerful message about kindness and respect. Small actions, standing up for what's right, offering an apology, or acknowledging mistakes, hold the power to transform the world around us. Remember, kindness doesn't just change others, it changes us too. Thank you for following today's story. If you've been inspired, please like, share, and subscribe to Stories About Kindness to help spread these messages of compassion. Let's work together to build a better world, one small act, one story at a time.